She was beaten for bearing daughters until the widowed cowboy said, "Then let me raise them proud." Dusk bled over Buckskin while woodsmoke sketched crooked roofs, and whiskey laughter died mid-note. Sarah Whitlock, 29, clutched a slick newborn to her chest on a leaning porch, one sandal missing, breath hitching. Behind her, Eliza, 5, and Clara, 3, pressed knuckles to their mouths. The door banged open. Amos Reed staggered out, bottle swinging, knuckles white. "Another girl," he rasped. 3 curses in 6 years. He lifted his fist. A neighbor turned, then hurried on. The street held still, like a rattler before strike. A wagon groaned to a stop beside the hitch rail. A tall rancher stepped down, dust haloing his hat brim, grief etched deep as river cuts. Caleb Thornton took stock, the blood, the children, the raised hand, and set a hammer on the rail with deliberate care. His voice carried clearly, "If daughters are a crime, let me raise them proud." Poker chips froze mid-air. Amos laughed, harsh as tin. "Back away." Caleb didn't. "You're scaring babies." The newborn hiccuped, then went quiet. Sarah felt the world narrow to 3 small heartbeats, and a choice. Hoofbeats drummed beyond the last house. A dog barked and fled. Amos lowered the bottle, then reached behind his back. Metal flashed, his wedding knife. He flicked it open. The click traveled. Caleb stepped once onto the porch, palms empty, eyes steady. No child is a mistake. Amos's grin showed a chip in front. "Prove it." He seized the railing, leaned close, and pressed the knife flat against his own cheek, drawing a thin, bright line, then held the blade out toward Caleb. "Trade," he said softly, "your face for mine. Then take them." Breath stalled across the street. Eliza's fingers found Clara's. The knife hovered between men, catching lamplight. Caleb's jaw flexed. He reached. The blade moved. "What followed will steal your breath." Buckskin baked beneath a hard white sun, while wind scraped grit along Main and made boardwalks creak like tired knees. And in that heat, a person could smell metal, sweat, mash, and a little fear. Saloons stared each other down with mirrored promises. Quick whiskey, quicker loans, and coin ruled sharper than any statute because the crooked courthouse sold mercy by the ounce. A deputy with a tilted badge leaned on a post and let verdicts pass like dust. Peddlers hawked miracle tonics. Cardmen nudged luck with bent deals. The church bell cracked only when someone bought contrition. Women kept eyes down at the pump, swapped needles and news in murmurs, and taught daughters to step wide around trouble. In that town, Sarah Whitlock learned to survive by reading the air. 10 years earlier, at 16, she wore a calico dress and a ribbon Amos Reed bought at the fair. He had wheat hair, a set jaw, and a laugh that made crowds turn. Folks called him reliable, destined to own more than he could count. He courted with gentle hands and big talk homestead past the cottonwoods, creek for Sunday washing, locust posts for a stout corral. Boys with his eyes running the ridge. She believed because belief felt like air, and because a girl that age thinks vows are rails that keep a life on track. After the wedding, rules hardened into ledgers. Amos kept months, glances, chores, and hours stacked in his head, and marked each season without a son as debt. When Eliza came, he smiled for a day and then went quiet. When Clara followed, he poured silence over pride with whiskey. Footsteps grew loud. Laughter dulled, walls learned the shape of a fist. The house smelled of mash more than bread. Sarah patched shirts, set quilts over small bodies, and practiced calm the way a rider practices seat, because stillness sometimes keeps a buck from throwing you. She hid a slim book under the mattress and read by lamplight when the house slept. Words steadied breath when doors rattled. Eliza, 5, already tall, noticed knots, clouds, and faces, tucked each detail away like a scout, and placed herself between danger and her sister without fanfare. Clara, 3, carried a rag pony, counted dandelions until her palms went gold, and slid under tables when voices pitched wrong. They clung to their mother as if holding her might keep the floor from tilting. Love anchored Sarah, even when Amos measured worth only in sons and measured everything else in blame. Buckskin's rhythm demanded caution. Men lost wages at faro, stumbled into alleys, and took losses out on whatever stood close. The judge pretended impartiality, though every pocket knew his price. Soot smeared chimneys, coyotes cried on the far ridge, and the sun burned long until woodsmoke braided with whiskey breath and made evening smell like surrender. On that edge of a world, Caleb Thornton held a line against corrosion. 30 and weathered, he ran a modest ranch west of town where soil thinned to red shoulders and water sat deep like memory. Fever had taken his wife, Mary, and their little boy 2 winters ago. The doctor blamed bad air in the drawers, and Caleb blamed luck that spares no one forever. He kept Mary's portrait on the mantel, and a lumpy clay horse his son shaped on a shelf, where morning light touched it. Work steadied grief. Honesty steadied work. He rode fence, pruned a stubborn orchard, and spoke plain because plain talk wastes nothing. He avoided town when he could, not out of disdain but because noise unsettled him. Yet feed, nails and salt pull a man the way gravity does. So on the afternoon everything tilted. He drove a wagon past the reed place, while heat wavered above ruts, mule ears flicked at flies, and thunder muttered far away with no promise of rain. He saw a shape slide off the porch step as if boards had dissolved. One arm wrapped a bundled newborn, the other braced against splinters. A tin pail rolled, spilling a silver ribbon that vanished before it soaked into the dust. 2 girls crouched close, faces pale through a sieve of dirt. Caleb halted, dropped down, and crossed the yard with the caution a man uses around a spooked mare. He checked the infant by sight, the lift of breath, the color at the mouth, then knelt where Eliza could see both hands. "Name's Caleb Thornton," he said evenly. "I run the place west." Eliza tipped her chin as if measuring the sky and pressed Clara closer. "Mama needs help," she whispered. "Please don't wake him." The doorway behind them held a darkness heavier than shade. A bottleneck glinted inside it. Sarah tried to sit and folded with pain. Caleb kept his eyes on the ground a pace in front of her, asking permission by refusing to stare. "I brought a wagon," he said softly. "Blankets in back, water in a jug. I can carry whatever you say." Eliza weighed that, glanced at her mother and nodded once. He fetched clean wool, slipped it under Sarah's shoulders, poured a little water into a tin cap, and passed it so Eliza could lift it to cracked lips. Across Maine, the deputy paused, then pretended to see nothing. 2 men from the saloon watched, decided no wager lived here, and drifted on. The town held back like a tired horse refusing a creek. Caleb counted costs: carry the woman and earn an enemy, walk away and turn into a man Mary would not know, call a doctor and leave them under a roof that had learned violence. He chose the cost he could live with. "Miss Whitlock," he said, using the name he had heard at a livery stall, "you can come to my place. No coin, no strings, no hurry, just distance." Sarah closed her eyes, not to pray so much as to add weight to the scale inside her chest. She pictured Eliza's solemn courage, Clara's small hand, a newborn's breath against skin, and the way Amos's steps sometimes began like rolling thunder and ended like a blow. "He'll follow," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "Then he'll see me at my fence," he answered. "He can shout at the wood until morning." A breath that might have been a laugh caught in Eliza's throat. Clara held up the rag pony for the stranger to see as if an offering might buy safety. They rose together. Caleb slid an arm behind Sarah's shoulders, while Eliza steadied the infant, and Clara hugged the toy. They crossed the yard like people crossing ice. The deputy scratched his neck and studied a cloud that wasn't there. No voice came from the dark beyond the bottle. At the wagon, Caleb lifted Clara first, then Eliza, then waited while Sarah gathered what strength remained. He tucked the blanket around the girls, set the water within reach, and stepped back. "Say the word," he murmured. She watched Maine as if expecting the town to lean forward and drag them back. Nothing moved except a tuft of cotton fluff crossing the road. "Drive," she said. The team leaned into leather, iron rolled, and Buckskin began to recede. Saloon windows tacked notices, a hitch rail polished by 100 rains. The road west ran between scrub and red stone. Dusk came early, because worry shortens life. Eliza named landmarks in a steady whisper. Bent fence post, burned snag, owl feather caught in mesquite, as if naming could hold the world together. Clara peeked under the blanket to count tiny toes, then counted again because numbers felt like spells. Sarah watched the horizon for riders and watched Caleb's hands on the lines, steady as a metronome. He spoke only when needed, a habit learned from long hours with stock and weather. Near the cottonwoods, the air cooled and smelled faintly of damp earth, and the team eased as if even animals understand sanctuary. The ranch showed itself when the sun lodged under the far rim and lit window glass like banked coals. A stout fence led to a square-hung gate. An old mare lifted her head and snorted once. The orchard stood in patient rows, leaves dusty and stubborn but alive. Caleb halted near the porch, climbed down and waited with his hands visible. Only when Sarah nodded did he lift Clara, then Eliza, and offer an arm while she stepped to the ground. He kept his distance, so she could choose the pace toward the door. Heat and the smell of applewood breathed out from within. On the table sat a loaf wrapped in a towel and a crock of butter, soft at the edges. A kettle sighed near banked coal. On the mantel, Mary's portrait shared space with the little clay horse. Caleb spoke as if stating a fair trade. Room on the left, washtub behind the screen. Pump out back. I'll fetch buckets. You and the girls take the bed. I'll use the barn. No one crosses your threshold without your say. Sarah tried to thank him and found tears instead. Eliza squared her shoulders and whispered gratitude for all of them. Clara set the rag pony on a chair and stroked its yarn mane like a living thing. The infant sighed, and the house changed with that sound, as if walls shifted from empty to alive. Fear did not vanish. It loosened a fraction. Standing inside that sliver of mercy, Sarah felt something unfurl that had been clenched for years, and though night pressed against the window panes, a thin current of hope moved through the room like a draught that could carry a flame. Night settled softly around the ranch, while the house breathed of hay, wood smoke, and apples drying near the stove. And in that mingled scent, Sarah Whitlock stood inside the threshold, holding her newborn while Eliza and Clara hovered at her skirt. Caleb Thornton kept a step back, hat in his hands, voice even and brief. He set a loaf, a wedge of cheese and a jar of late peaches on the table, spread 2 wool blankets at the foot of the bed, filled a basin with warm water, and said he would sleep in the barn so they could rest without worry. Sarah nodded, because thank you had been twisted into debt before, and she watched him close the door with a careful hand that clicked the latch once. The house held a hush like the inside of a cupped hand. They washed quietly. Steam fogged the small mirror. The cloth turned the color of road dust. Eliza ate like a soldier out of sight of fire, shoulders square, eyes on the door, while Sarah dipped bread in peach syrup until sweetness loosened the knot under her ribs. From the barn came the steady talk of a man listing chores to calm the night. Check the latch, blanket the mare, bank the lamp, set the rake where a hand can find it in the dark. She listened for the hook that would yank a price from them later, and heard none. When the newborn fussed, Sarah turned from the door and fed her in privacy, learned over hard years. Milk drew, breath steadied. The fire ticked. On the mantel stood a small clay horse, with a lopsided tail beside a portrait of a woman, whose calm seemed to hold back grief, like a shoreline holds back tide. A folded note lay on the table in block letters. Hot water at first light. Barn for me. Knock if needed. The brevity steadied her. She tucked the note under a mug, and chose to answer later, or never, selecting at last which silence belonged to her. Clara fell asleep first, a small hand clutching the rag pony. Eliza asked if she should keep watch. Sarah said sentries must rest, or they miss the real trouble. The child accepted the logic and slid under the blanket with private dignity. Sarah pressed a damp cloth to her ribs and stared at the door as if it could decide to open by itself. Beyond the walls, a horse shifted weight, metal touched wood, and a man murmured to animals in a tone worn smooth by use. The sound pulled a memory of the schoolmaster who once gave her a primer and told her to read until words felt like stones in a pocket. Amos had burned that primer the spring after Eliza was born. She let the memory pass like a cold wind that had already crossed the house. Before dawn, a gentle knock and the hush of a pail set down woke her. Steps retreated across boards. Gray seeped into the window. Fresh milk warmed her hands. A small wrapped bar of soap sat beside an extra bucket. She bathed the girls until their cheeks glowed. Eliza stood straighter. Clara named the steam little ghosts, and tried to catch them until Sarah said some sounds keep wolves away, and laughter returned in soft waves. Caleb brought stove wood after the sun cleared the ridge, remained 2 boards away, and asked whether anything was lacking. She said she would like to boil linens. He fetched a back iron pot, levered it onto the rings, and left before the water stirred. Only then did Eliza ask from the porch whether coyotes would come close to the orchard. He explained low rails and ground wire and said, lambs learn safety by touch as much as by height. He talked the way people do when they would rather build than persuade. Chores arranged themselves into a quiet rhythm. Sarah boiled cloth, soothed the baby, and set small tasks, folding, stacking, fetching kindling by twos. Caleb mended a hinge where she could watch his hands. If he needed to cross the threshold for a tool, he paused and waited for a nod. At noon, he slid a pan of beans and a square of cornbread near the coals, then stepped back so they could eat first. Only afterward did he take a corner for himself, standing outside with the plate balanced on the sill. When he finished, he wiped the tin with a scrap and asked whether the girls liked stories. Eliza said stories should teach. Clara said stories should shine. He lowered himself to the threshold so his boots stayed outside, and began in a tone gentle enough to let the baby sleep. He told of a stubborn star that lived low on the horizon, where dust and wind tried every night to push it into the dark. The star borrowed light from neighbors when thin, flared when the wind thought it had won, and marked the trail for travelers who had lost the road, and did not yet know they had found a guide. He never said the star was a person or what lesson to keep. He let pauses deliver meaning. Clara touched the clay horse and whispered that the star might like to ride. Eliza asked how a star learns if it only burns. He said fire listens better than most men, and let the room hold that line. Sarah felt a tug behind her ribs, the kind that pulls water through dry earth. She still watched his shadow through the curtain whenever he crossed the yard, counting his steps the way a traveler counts mile markers, braced for the turn that had always come before. In her chest 2 measures kept time, one for caution and one for relief, and neither would yet yield to the other. When the girls napped, she tested the latch twice because certainty felt like a tool she had been denied for years. Even the quiet unnerved her, because quiet in the old house had often been the gap before a storm. Yet this hush carried the small sounds of work done well, and nothing hid sharp behind it. She told herself that kindness could be theater, that charity could be a bid for control, and the evidence in this place refused to gather against him. He ended with morning arriving and stars resting, then stood and said he would walk the east fence before night. She waited for a ledger line, a favor wrapped in soft paper, and heard none. Afternoon stacked signs of ordinary life, the pump fixed, the hinge silent, the mare's hoof trimmed, a neat pile of firewood cut to the length of the stove box, a hammer hung on a nail within arm's reach of the door. He asked whether she wanted a rifle by the jam. She said no and added, pleased to soften the refusal because the choice felt new and she wanted it to last. He tipped his hat and said, a hammer argues well enough with trouble, then went to the corral. A draft carried the orchard's green scent through the room and lifted a memory of a younger self, reading near a wash line, and hiding pages when footsteps sounded. On the shelf a slim book with a cracked spine leaned like a worker who meant to keep standing. She did not touch it, admitting she wanted to was enough. Evening gathered without menace. The fire laid a patient triangle of light across the floor. They ate the last peach with a slow ceremony and saved the syrup for morning porridge. Sarah brushed the girl's hair until it shone, counting strokes, because counting kept panic from breeding. Caleb checked the latch and the window stick, wished each by name a quiet night and used Miss Whitlock for her, as if a title could be shelter. He said he would keep the lamp low in the barn and listen for changes in the wind, no more and no less. When the door closed, Sarah exhaled a breath she had not known she was keeping. She laid the baby in the warm hollow of her arm, and stretched out on the quilt, While Eliza took the bed to practice being strong for tomorrow, Clara curled like a comma at her side. Outside, a dog barked once and decided otherwise. The house ticked and sighed. Quiet frightened her more than noise, yet she watched the coals dim and told herself that rest is also a task. On the table, the folded note rested beside a pencil. She thought about writing a line that thanked him, and asked nothing because asking had been used as a leash before, then left the paper untouched and chose sleep in pieces, waking to count the small breaths in the room. Have you ever met someone whose kindness made you question everything? Hold that thought as Sarah does. Just before her eyes closed for good, she heard the barn door murmur and the soft scrape of a chair on plank as a man settled to keep watch where he said he would. And the sound threaded through fear like a stitch that might hold until morning. Not a promise, not a claim, only proof that caution and care can live in the same place. And that was enough to let her drift at last. True. Late light slid through the orchard and laid quiet ladders across the table where a modest row of books rested beside Mary's crooked clay horse, their cloth spines faded by sun and years of handling, and Sarah paused with the drying towel half folded, startled by the ordinary daring of pages left in the open. She had not touched a book without hiding since the spring, when Amos tossed her primer into a kettle and called the smoke education enough. She set the towel down, ran a fingertip over a title in flaking gilt, and lifted the cover. The paper smelled of dust and ink. In the margin, a neat pencil had once explained how a river changes course without asking permission. Eliza climbed onto a chair to see letters close, chin tipped with the solemn pride of a scout, while Clara circled, dragging the rag pony and whispering its opinions about every curious thing. From the doorway, Caleb spoke low, so as not to break the hush. Mary kept those where light could find them, he said. She read after chores, and our boy would follow her finger, until he decided the stories rode ponyback across the page. Sarah let the book fall. I read when I was little, she said. Ma saved nickels for a primer. After marriage, the primer turned to smoke. No sermon came. Caleb's face held only listening. He set a tin of pencils and a packet of charcoal on the table. I can fix fences and mend wagons, he said. But Mary taught me a day goes better if you sketch it first. He turned to Eliza. Want to learn to capture wind? Eliza looked at Sarah. Sarah almost refused, then nodded when Clara's hand reached for charcoal, as if for a biscuit. Caleb laid brown paper between the girls, showed how to brace a wrist, drew a fence post, then a mesquite that leaned like a habit. He offered a pencil to Sarah without pressing. You can draw the steam, he said, pointing at the kettle's pale ribbon. Heat rose in her face at the strangeness of being invited back into a world she had been told to drop. She shook her head and stood closer to watch. Clara made a determined scribble that looked like dawn, remembering itself. Eliza's marks became straight rails and a small bird facing the wind. That bird knows something, he said. It doesn't waste power beating the wrong way. Eliza allowed a thin smile. Sarah kept searching for the hook under generosity and felt a thread loosen along her ribs. Mary loved books, Caleb said, voice even. She read while I whittled, and when fever took our boy, she read anyway because the sound held the house when silence wanted to tear it. He touched the clay horse with the back of his knuckles to keep prints off. He shaped that after she showed him how to press a thumb for the shoulder and pinch an ear. Clara lifted a reverent finger, then stopped when Sarah gave a tiny shake of her head. Respecting other people's things had become their first rule here. Sentences straightened my thoughts, Sarah said. But marriage made thoughts into trouble. Caleb did not argue her past. He unrolled more paper and set a candle stub near the edge for weight. Sometimes a man builds a house like a trap without noticing, he said. Sometimes he notices. His eyes asked nothing. They held ground like a fence post. Witness, not judge. Eliza held up her bird. Sarah praised the lean of the back and the beak aimed at a distance. Caleb showed Clara how to smear a fingertip into charcoal to make a cloud. Clara gasped, as if given a warning for a pocket. We'll put drawings above the bed, he said. A house should show who lives inside. Sarah heard the sentence as an invitation to exist, and stood still to bear it. She scanned the shelf. A sermon, a travel journal about rivers, a primer with loose binding, 2 small books of poems stitched in blue thread. The letters felt like friends returned from a long road. She traced the alphabet, turned a page, and found a line about cotton light making maps across bare feet. The phrase struck so clean she almost said it aloud. Caleb told Eliza how to measure angles with the side of a pencil. The child listened, precise and serious. Sarah watched his browned, nicked hands and waited for the lesson to slide into ownership. It did not. He praised a clumsy fence that still stood and laughed softly when Clara drew a horse with 4 tails. Because, as Clara explained, speed needs extra flags. The laughter warmed instead of cutting. A breeze wandered through and fluttered a page. Mary's portrait above the mantel seemed to approve. "I keep her smile there," Caleb said when he noticed Sarah studying the frame. "Some mornings it keeps me from walking to the ridge and not coming back." He did not dress sorrow in heroics. He set it on the table like a tool and let it be seen. Sarah recognized that plainness. She had hidden grief until it turned feral. She wanted to tell him a newborn's fingers had taught her that family can be made of those who choose gentleness, then kept silent. Instead, she took the pencil near her elbow, made one hesitant line, and paused. Caleb kept his face neutral, as if a bird had landed near his. She drew steam above the kettle, the curve of the handle, the thin, bright rim. Her hand shook, then steadied. The paper accepted her the way a trail accepts feet. Eliza said the steam looked like ribbons tossed by the wind at a fair. Clara said it looked like ghosts, learning to dance. Sarah smiled despite herself. Caleb set a small tin cup beside the drawing, like a period. "The hardest part is believing your hand remembers." His tone carried no surprise, only respect. Afternoon settled into amber. The orchard sounded like breathing. Sarah wiped her palms on her skirt, a habit asking permission to enjoy a thing, and finding none required. In that quiet, she risked a question. "Do you get angry at them for leaving?" Caleb weighed the words. "I get angry at air that won't warm and rivers that change in drought," he said. "Mary never left me. Time did. Same with our boy. I still light the lamp like she asked when the wind screams, and I put the horse where the sun meets it." He traced the clay again. "I work harder when I miss them. That keeps love in the room." Sarah slid the primer back into place with care that felt like an apology and promise at once. Doubt would return as surely as night and whisper that every offering hides a hook. Still, when Caleb pinned Eliza's bird to the wall with a cornhusk twist and told Clara the 4-tailed horse should guard the door, something inside shifted a notch toward ease. Think of a time you saw strength in someone's quiet actions. That's what Sarah's seeing now. She tightened the baby's blanket and felt her breath lighten. Guarded, she told herself. Evening edged the windows. Caleb set lamps low and asked if they wanted him to read. Sarah almost refused, then nodded. He read from the river journal about a ferryman who carried strangers through the flood and never asked names. His cadence did not perform. It meant every syllable. The girl's eyes drooped while the ferryman poled through foam, and Sarah listened to the scrape of a page turning and decided it sounded like a door opening on oiled hinges. She would not step through tonight, not fully, yet she could feel the room again as hers, and that gave courage to bank the coals and let dark arrive without rehearsing every exit. When he turned down the wick, Mary's portrait caught the last spark and gave it back like a blessing, and Sarah, wary though less alone, set her palms on the table where the books meant to stay and did not flinch. Days settled into a kinder pattern, as the orchard whispered and the house remembered how to breathe. Caleb Thornton cut willow by the creek, shaved flecks into the sticks, and set scraps of muslin on the rail. He told Eliza the sky rewards balance, and told Clara a kite must listen before it climbs. Sarah watched from the doorway with the newborn tucked against her shoulder, soreness easing by inches. He crossed the frame with twine, pasted paper with flour glue, and tied a tail from old cloth. Eliza smoothed wrinkles with a seriousness that made Sarah proud. Clara pressed corners until paste made tiny moons along the edge. They walked past the corral to a slope where the wind ran clean. Caleb handed Eliza the string, trotted backward, and waited for a lift while Clara ran under the tail, shouting at invisible coyotes. The kite wavered, caught and rose, a stitched flag tugging against blue. Eliza's stern face softened. Clara hopped like a sparrow. Sarah pressed her palm to her ribs and let out a sound that felt like release. Caleb never looked back to measure the effect. He read the line with his hands, nodding when the string hummed, guiding Eliza through a slow give and take until the pull steadied. For the first time since leaving Buckskin, the afternoon stretched instead of splintering. Evenings gathered around lamplight. On the third night he knocked, waited and offered a slim book in brown paper. Mary, he said, loved parables that eased hard truths into gentle images, and the girls might sleep better with a tidy ending. Sarah turned the parcel, then opened a fable about a desert fox who learned from an old tortoise that speed mistakes itself for wisdom. She read softly, steadier as Eliza's shoulders lowered, and Clara tucked the rag pony beneath her chin. Caleb sat on the step, close enough to hear, far enough to leave the threshold hers. When she reached the line where the fox chose the trail back instead of the storm road, he released a quiet breath that sounded like respect. She closed the book and felt a small flame strengthen behind her ribs. Daylight made room for work and learning. Caleb taught Eliza reliable knots and showed Clara how soaked beans swell like promises. Sarah folded diapers from a cut sheet and kept the baby warm while moving through tasks. He hummed while he swept, a low tune that made rooms feel held. One afternoon he laid apples on a towel and reached to take the newborn while Sarah rinsed a kettle. Fence scars and sunlines did nothing to roughen the tenderness of his hands. He rocked with a trail lullaby under his breath. The baby yawned, blinked, and caught a vest seam with new fingers. Sarah turned, saw unguarded care, and felt tears rise from a deep place. They ran without shame and eased the pressure she had carried for years. Caleb said nothing that might turn feeling into display. Later she carried the book into the yard, read the next fable to both girls, while Caleb planed a warped plank at the gate, and realized her voice no longer trembled. She kissed Clara's hair and told Eliza every creature keeps a true gift even when the world tries to trade it away. Eliza said quiet things endure. Sarah agreed without words. Kindness collected like dew. A warmed mug waited each dawn. Wood lay stacked where rain could not reach. A hammer hung by the door where Sarah could take it without crossing the room. He wiped his hands before touching books, returned chairs to their marks, and avoided crossing lines once they were set. On Sundays he tightened cinches, checked hooves, and stood by the fence, naming clouds with the girls, while Sarah sat on the step with the infant, sleeping across her lap. She watched creatures answer his voice, and felt a tightness uncoil between her shoulders. Rumor, though, rode where it pleased. In town, lost wages grew stories. Names traveled between teeth. Amos Reed's tongue sharpened when coin thinned. The deputy's badge still tilted. The judge still weighed favors. By late week, a peddler carried talk about a scene on the Reed porch, and the tale lengthened with every retell. Some said a widower stole a family. Others claimed a drunk met a boot and found respect. Sarah felt that shadow whenever the wind turned. She worked faster, listening for hoofbeats that did not belong. Caleb did not name threat. He added a rail to the gate, oiled hinges until they whispered, cut rawhide lengths for quick ties, and hung a second lantern where a hand could find it blind. Eliza practiced dropping the bar. Clara rehearsed fetching the hammer. Sarah learned the turn that set the latch true. Caution, he said, is not fear, only prudence with eyes open. After lessons, he returned to ordinary talk so the children heard steadiness, not alarm. On a gold afternoon the kite flew again. The string thrummed. The tail carved pale arcs. Laughter reached than dust. Sarah felt the sun gather warmth along her collarbone and thought a life might be rebuilt from pieces like these. A sharpened blade, a song, a story chosen for a child's sleep, a straightened plank that lets a door lie. She lowered her gaze and found Caleb watching the girls like rain returning, after a long season, not as a rite, not as a miracle, as relief earned by patience. He tipped his hat and looked away, granting privacy to a feeling not ready to carry the weight. She held his look and did not flinch. The admission formed without speech. He had become a shelter that announces nothing yet keeps storms from devouring a threshold. That night she read about a raven who traded bright trinkets for friendship and learned shine does not equal safety. Eliza remarked that sound pretends to be courage. Clara said the wall horse would guard against pretend courage by staying still. Caleb chuckled through his nose, set another log, and kept the flame until dream steady. Later Sarah lay awake, listening to the lullaby from the barn, surprised to learn that a sound could hold instead of harm. When rest arrived it came. Morning brought a hawk circling the pasture, and frost shining along the fence. Caleb rode the boundary, and returned with news of a wagon track bending toward the road from town. He poured coffee, set the cup where Sarah liked it, and sharpened a chisel with strokes that made music. They understood each other without words. Talk cannot be stopped, but rails can be strengthened, hinges shored, courage stored in habits. She buttoned the baby's wrap, braided Eliza's hair, kissed Clara's brow, and held the book before sliding it back on the shelf. The day unrolled, ordinary and precarious. She stepped into it with her weight set for turns, ready to claim calm while it lasted, and ready to meet whatever rode out of Buckskin, with the steadiness she had learned from a grieving man, who treated care as skill rather than favor, and from two girls who had learned, far too early, to read wind and choose life. Heat hung hard over the flats when 4 riders peeled off the road and headed for the orchard, hooves drumming, dust lifting. Caleb Thornton felt the vibration through the porch boards, set down his plane, and took the hammer from the nail. He looked once through the doorway. Sarah had the baby tight against her collarbone. Eliza stood by the door bar. Clara clutched the rag pony. Inside, he said quietly. Sarah slid the bolt, drew the curtain, and moved the girls behind the bed, while he stepped out and faced the gate. Amos Reed led the line, jaw hard, eyes bright with drink. A scarred drover flanked him with rawhide looped on his saddle horn. A lanky hand in a kerchief balanced a carbine across his thigh. A broad rider's coat bulged where a club waited. They pulled up short at the fresh rail. Caleb had set 3 days ago. Amos smiled thinly. "You've got my wife," he said, "and her whelps. I'm here to collect." Caleb let the hammer rest against his thigh. "No person is free," he said. "Turn back." Amos spat into the dust. "You mean to stop 4 with a barn tool?" Caleb's gaze did not shift. "I mean to stop a wrong thing with what I have," he said. The kerchief man slid the carbine to his shoulder. The drover tightened fingers under the rawhide loop. The broad rider waited. Inside, Sarah pressed her spine to the wall until the boards felt like a brace. Eliza whispered the steps Caleb had drilled. "Listen, wait, drop the bar if the latch moves." Clara put a palm to the floor to feel faint hoofbeats. Sarah counted breaths to keep terror from climbing her throat. "Open the gate," Amos called. "I ain't asking." Caleb lifted the hammer to his shoulder like a wing. "Step that rail," he said. "You trespass, I will not let you take them." The word rang against the fence like iron on stone. The drover nudged his horse. It balked at the bar. The kerchief man raised the sight. The broad rider grinned and reached under his coat. Caleb did not raise his voice. "Here no child is a burden," he said. "Here no woman is property." Amos let out a laugh that wobbled. "Town says otherwise. Coin says otherwise." Caleb glanced toward the road. "Coin cannot change blood into baggage." Hoofbeats sounded behind the 4. A freighter reined in by the cottonwood and stayed. A mail driver watched. 2 women from the pump stood at the fence. Last came the deputy, badge dusty. Amos saw eyes gathering and sneered. "Witnesses won't help you," he barked. "Law's with me." "Law has eyes," Caleb answered. "Let it look." Amos swung down, tugged a knife, and strode to the gate. He set the blade to the rail. Caleb stepped in, set the hammer neck against Amos's wrist and spoke one word. "No." The blade paused. The kerchief man twitched the barrel higher. Caleb's eyes never left the wrist. "You cut my fence," he said. "You carve yourself out of any story you can live with." Sarah felt that no run through the floor and bone. She stayed still and kissed the baby. Eliza set her hand on the bar. Clara whispered that the wall horse was standing guard. Amos shoved the knife home and drove his boot against the gate. It held. The broad rider slid the club free. The drover lifted his rawhide. The kerchief man drew breath. Caleb spoke to the three who had ridden with a cruel errand. "This is a ranch," he said. "Not a pen. Those children breathe free air just like you. Ride home. Home needs a son." Amos snapped. He jabbed a finger toward the door. "She owes me one." Caleb let a breath go. "She owes you nothing. A child is a gift, not a tax." The road formed a ring without touching the gate. The deputy sat straighter. The pump woman did not blink. Amos tried swagger again and found it slipping. "Aim high," he ordered the kerchief man. "Scare him." The barrel rose. Caleb stepped into the muzzle's path, turned the hammer to hook the barrel, and let flint settle in his voice. "Don't." The kerchief hand froze, arrested by a tone a trail boss uses when a herd might turn. The drover's rawhide drooped. The broad rider lifted, then lowered, then let his arm fall. Amos lunged for the hinge and tried to wrench the gate free by rage alone. Caleb rotated with him, used the hinge as leverage, and shifted him 2 steps back without striking. "Go," he said, quiet, final. Amos's fury shrank into threats he could carry. "I'll sue," he spat. "I'll drag you before a judge and make him say my rights." Caleb nodded as if to weather. "Bring your story under oath," he said. "Tell how you raised your hand against a mother. Tell how you rode with 3 to take children like freight. I will speak and we will see what the town is willing to be." Silence thickened. The market basket woman saying. Sarah had read with her girl at the pump. The baker noting bruises. The mail driver muttering that a man who needs 3 to fetch a baby should keep his hat low. The deputy finally used his badge. "Best you ride, Reed," he called. The kerchief man lowered the carbine. The drover coiled the rawhide. The broad rider tucked the club under his coat. Their horses turned toward the road on their own. Amos looked at them and saw followers becoming witnesses. He slammed the knife home, threw himself into the saddle, and tried a last jab with his mouth. "This isn't finished." "It is here," Caleb said. Amos jerked his reins and clattered off. The 3 fell in behind, already small. Nobody cheered, quite honored danger by not breaking too soon. Caleb stood until the dust settled, then lowered the hammer along his forearm and touched the score the knife had left on the rail. He turned to the door. Sarah opened it. The baby slept warm against her neck. Eliza stepped close. Clara pressed the pony to the post. Caleb tipped his hat toward the girls, then to the road. "Thank you for your eyes," he said. People turned and went back to work. Sarah reached and touched the hammer, then the scar in the wood. Her voice failed. Caleb offered the line she needed. "No child is a weight in this yard," he said. "For the boards, the orchard, the wind, and anyone who would carry it home." Sarah rested her palm flat on the rail and finally breathed without counting. "Ever seen someone stand up for what's right, no matter the odds? That's Caleb's choice." Dawn thinned the dark until the orchard showed its ribs, and Sarah Whitlock sat at the table with the newborn against her shoulder. The fire a low red eye, a scrap of paper under her hand. She had slept in splinters, waking to the same thought. Joy does not belong to you. The house offered another truth. Eliza's steady breathing from the bed, Clara's soft huff where the rag pony rode her arm, the faint murmur from the barn where Caleb Thornton kept watch when the wind changed. But the old map in her mind still pointed toward leaving before happiness could fail her. She wrote in a neat, schoolgirl hand that surprised her with its steadiness. "I am grateful for your shelter, and I will not bring more danger to your door." She laid the note beside a warmed mug, kissed Eliza's hair without waking her, pressed a palm to Clara's back, wrapped the blanket tighter around the baby, and slipped out while the horizon was still a pale seam. She walked toward the road that led away from the orchard and everything that had begun to fit like mercy. In the room the fire gave one sigh and went low. Eliza woke to cold where warmth should be, saw the mug, saw the paper, and straightened so her hands would not shake. She read the lines once, folded the note into her pocket like an order, and shook Clara's shoulder. "Boots," she whispered. Clara sat up, hair a tangle, eyes foggy, and asked for Mama, as if the name alone could summon safety. Eliza reached the door just as Caleb stepped onto the porch, hat in hand, face set in a calm that held room for grief and action both. He listened without interrupting, then went to a small box on the mantel, opened it, and lifted a silver oval on a thin chain. He knelt so Eliza could see the tiny curl inside the glass. "This was my Mary's," he said, voice low. "When the house lost sound, I kept this to remember the light." He placed the locket in Eliza's palm and closed her fingers around it. "Tell your mama she deserves to live." Eliza nodded once, tucked the chain into her dress, and ran for the yard. Caleb swung into the saddle and kept the horse to an easy jog on the track, so his dust would not blind the child. They followed small signs, the bent weed by the gate, a shallow print toward the road, a thorn that had snagged a thread from Sarah's skirt and held it up like a flag. They climbed a low rise, crossed a dry wash, and caught sight of a figure moving along the road ahead, small as a punctuation mark that might change meaning if reached in time. Eliza called. Sarah did not stop. Love arriving at the wrong hour felt like a hand on a bruise. Eliza drew close enough for words to carry. She lifted the locket so it caught the thin sun and spoke the message. "He said to tell you you deserve to live." The sentence lit the old map and burned a new road across it. Sarah stumbled and caught herself. She wanted to tell her brave child that deserving had never been part of survival, that safety must be earned twice when the first time was stolen, that leaving was protection, not betrayal. What came out was smaller and truer. "If I stay, I bring danger." Eliza did not crowd her. She held the chain steady and let the oval rest in her mother's palm. "Hold it," she said. "Feel how it warms. That is what happens to things meant to stay." Sarah closed her fingers. The locket took the heat from her skin and gave it back. The tiny strand inside felt like a hinge between women who had never met, and were nonetheless kin by choosing steadiness over despair. "He is not the only one who refuses to stop," Eliza added, glancing toward the trail where Caleb kept his distance. "The way a careful rider keeps weight off a tender back." He tipped his hat but did not speak, letting the moment belong to mother and daughter. Sarah looked at the track ahead and at the path back and could not breathe for the weight of choosing. She thought of the kite rising above the red ridge and of Caleb's hands steadying the string without stealing it. She thought of the sentence at the gate when 4 riders came hungry for ownership. "No child is a burden." She thought of the night she read about a fox who learned to turn back from thunder. She thought of Mary's portrait catching lamplight and giving it back like a promise. "I do not know how to be worth what he gives," she said. Eliza answered with the certainty a child learns by watching what works. "You do not earn a sunrise. You stand in." Sarah folded around those words and sobbed. Not the guarded tears she had learned to meet her, but the body-deep sound of grief emptying so that room for life could open. The baby drowsed through the shaking and then sighed as if agreeing that warmth was the correct direction. Sarah looked toward the ranch roof flashing between limbs and toward the empty road and found that one of them scared her less. She put the chain over her neck herself, the oval settling at her throat like a new weight meant to balance rather than bow. They walked. Caleb paced at a respectful distance, scanning the cottonwoods for any rider who might mistake this hour for an opening. They reached the gate at mid-morning. Clara ran from the porch and leaped into her mother's skirt. Sarah crouched and held her, whispering apology and promise into her hair, then rose and looked at Caleb across the rail where a knife had scored wood. Words crowded and he spared her by speaking first. "Welcome home," he said. "Thank you for turning." She nodded, tears fresh but clean. Inside, Eliza hung the locket on a nail by the mantel so fear would have to read before it spoke. Sarah washed her face and the baby's hands, pinned the note above the basin, and wrote a second line beneath it. "I came back." The new words steadied the earlier sentence like a brace under a beam. She hammered both to the wall because doubts return, and they need to see themselves wrong. She set bread and sat with her daughters while the house learned its weight again. Then Clara reported that pretend wolves had not crossed the porch even once. Caleb stood by the jamb, quiet, the look on his face a mixture of relief and resolve. In the hush that followed, Sarah admitted the other truth aloud. I left because I did not believe I deserved this. The confession did not sour the air. It cleared it. He nodded toward the locket. When fear starts its old talk, read that metal and let it answer. Sarah touched the oval and felt how it kept the warmth she had given, as if objects could practice loyalty when people had failed. The afternoon stretched. Caleb repaired a hinge, checked rails, and left the hammer where her hand could find it at the first blind reach. Eliza traced letters beneath the pinned promise. Sarah stood in the doorway and matched breathing to leaves until unrest loosened its grip. Shame tried one last time to plant a flag. It found little purchase. She looked at the road that had offered exile, and at the track that offered labor stitched with kindness, and chose a way without bargaining. She lit the lamp without shaking, opened the river journal to a page about a ferryman who carried strangers through a flood, and read aloud in a voice that did not break. Eliza sat tall, a sentry satisfied that a post had been held. Ever seen someone stand up for what is right, no matter the odds? That choice brought safety at the gate, and now a daughter's courage brought a mother back. Together they breathed 3 steady rhythms, and 1 sleeping heartbeat, and the house held it like a kept promise. She breathed, counted to 3, and let the number carry courage forward, then lifted her chin and chose a way that led to staying. 2 weeks after the standoff at the gate, a summons from Buckskin's courthouse landed on Caleb Thornton's table like a stone. Amos Reed had petitioned the territorial judge, accusing a widower of stealing a wife and 3 children from lawful custody and demanding their return. Caleb read the papers, set them beside the scar where Amos's knife had scraped the rail, and told Sarah that the truth would need daylight. She nodded, though her stomach turned as if a wagon wheel had slipped from a rut. On the hearing morning the town gathered, heat pooling beneath the eaves, flies fussing at the stuck door hinge, and a smell of ink, whiskey, and dust coloring every breath. The judge, square-shouldered and tired-eyed, took the bench while the clerk scratched names on a docket. Amos arrived shaved and polished, a new vest tight at the buttons, and a smile borrowed for the occasion. Sarah entered with the baby in her arms, and the girls at her skirt. Caleb followed with his hat off and his jaw set as if holding a plank steady in a storm. Amos's lawyer spoke first, laying out a claim wrapped in smooth phrases about order, property, and household safety. He called marriage a contract, cited scripture with practiced piety, and pointed at a vision of perfect discipline while avoiding facts that breathe. When he finished, Amos rose and performed a sentiment, declaring his home plundered by envy, his legacy threatened by meddling, his heart stripped by a neighbor hungry for praise without sons to prove worth. The judge asked for the defense. Caleb stepped forward without theater and said the fence had been mended, the gate kept, the hands open, and that a man does not own breath that does not live in his chest. He admitted he had carried blankets and water, had offered shelter, and had slept in his barn so a frightened mother and little ones could rest. He spoke the line that had traveled the road since the riders were turned. Here, no child is a burden. He looked at the floorboards as if truth deserves footing. The judge cleared his throat and asked whether the woman at issue wished to speak. A ripple moved through the benches, the sound of fabric and held breath. Sarah stood. She did not thrust her chin. She simply found her full height after years of stepping small. The newborn slept through it. Eliza's fingers tightened around Clara's. Sarah's voice was even. I wasn't stolen. I was saved. The words rang once and kept ringing. She said she had married at 16 to a man charming in public and cruel in private, that he measured worth in sons, that he turned whiskey into law inside their walls. She said neighbors had watched and looked away until a wagon stopped and a man offered distance without demanding payment. She said the girls had slept a whole night for the first time under a roof that did not echo with threats. She held up the locket so the court could see the tiny curl inside and said a woman she never knew had left steadiness for someone else to borrow when the hour came. The judge asked for testimony. Women rose. A washerwoman told how Sarah had taught her eldest to read letters on feed sacks while waiting at the pump. A baker's wife said the bruised mother had shown her girl how to count by tens with beans on a tray. The midwife told how Eliza had stood between a door and a bottle more than once, and that such duty belongs to no child. A widow described the day Caleb set a wagon wheel true for nothing, then walked home without expecting thanks, and said a house that collects such acts makes safer children. Even a saloon keeper's sister said the girls had recited a fable about a fox and a tortoise, and that the sound had calmed a room. Each account added weight where it mattered, not on Amos's claims, but on the scale of life lived as neighbor. Amos tried to reclaim control with a smear, arguing that stories were rumors, that people envied ambition, that women chase any tale that paints them brave. He waved at the girls, called them replacements for a son not yet arrived, and asked the court to order obedience. The judge raised one eyebrow at that word. He asked the deputy whether he had anything to report from the evening, when riders reached the ranch. The deputy, who had worn a tilted badge that night, stared at his hands, and then told the truth. He had watched a man step to a gate with a hammer and hold back trespass without striking, had heard a line about children not being burdens, had seen fear in small faces and stubbornness in a drunk. The room changed. Caleb did not speak again. He stood like a post driven deep. Sarah breathed and let the breathing reach places inside that had forgotten air. The judge took off his spectacles, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and asked whether any person could swear a theft had occurred as alleged. No one moved. Even the three who had ridden with Amos stared at the floor. He set the spectacles on again and began to rule, voice dry as paper and sharp as a new edge. He said marriage is not a deed to a body. Children are not freight to be reclaimed with rope. A neighbor's protection under threat is not trespass, and a court prefers truth told plainly over righteousness delivered with polish. He said he would not order a woman or a child back to a roof that had learned the shape of a fist. He declared Sarah Whitlock free from the petitioner's claim under territorial law and entered the order on the record. The clerk wrote, blotting the margin, and passed a copy across the rail. Air rushed back into the room. Someone sobbed once. Eliza leaned into Clara. Clara whispered that the wall horses had guarded the house even from far away. Caleb's hands stayed at his sides, the only sign of feeling a breath that reached the bottom of his lungs and stayed there. Women moved first. The washerwoman pressed Sarah's shoulder and asked for another reading lesson on sacks. The baker's wife offered a loaf and a quiet place if needed. The midwife tucked a pencil into Eliza's pocket, saying a scholar should never be caught without a tool. The deputy did not tip his badge. He straightened it. Men cleared a path without being told and pretended they had planned to do so. They stepped into noon. The street smelled of hot leather and pie. Shop doors spilled shade. Old habits looked smaller, as if the roof lines had lifted by an inch. Children chased a hoop. A dog blinked and slept on. The judge passed by. Caleb touched his hat. The judge returned the nod like two workers acknowledging a load set square. Sarah turned the paper toward the light and watched the ink. She thought of the note she had hammered above the basin, of the letters Eliza had traced under it, of the river journal's ferryman steering through flood, and felt something in her spine relax that had not relaxed since girlhood. By evening, the judge's words had ridden home in pockets and found chairs at supper. A notice went up in the church hall for a Thursday reading circle. Women brought sacks, primers, and stubborn daughters. The deputy kept his badge straight longer than anyone expected, including himself. Men who had chosen silence said fewer careless things. Amos left the courthouse by the side door, vest slack, carefully shined shoes dulling in dust. He tried to speak to the three who had ridden with him, but they looked past him toward a horizon he no longer saw. At the pump, a girl read aloud from a primer while her mother drew water, and no one told them to hush. Sarah folded the order and slid it into the locket's box for safekeeping, then fastened the oval at her throat. She walked the girls past the store windows, past the post, past the saloon door now swinging idly, to the wagon where Caleb waited. He did not say congratulations. He said, "You spoke plainly." She answered, "So did the town." They rode home in a silence that felt like a song. At the gate, the scar on the rail caught the sun and gleamed like a healed seam. Eliza touched it the way a reader taps a period.
Clara held the rag pony up to show it the place where the world had turned. Sarah stepped down, went inside, and pinned the certified page beside her earlier note. She read both lines aloud. "I am grateful. I came back." Then she added one more beneath them in a careful hand. "I am free." Have you ever witnessed someone reclaim their voice? That's Sarah's power now. The house listened. The orchard leaped, and a town that had looked away began, at last, to look right at the truth and keep its eyes there.
Autumn ripened the orchard until the apples shone like small lanterns, and the town gathered under the largest tree with a lace runner, late blossoms, and sugared slices. Sarah Whitlock stood there in calico, hair braided with a ribbon Eliza had pressed smooth. Caleb Thornton waited opposite, coat brushed, boots clean, hat off, his gaze calm as a settled sky. Between them, the girls giggled behind a handmade veil, worked from cheesecloth and thistle fluff. The judge held a paper and a neighbor's smile. Women set dishes along planks between sawhorses. Bunting brightened fence posts. The midwife hovered. The baker's wife framed the moment with an armful of flowers. The washerwoman's eldest clutched a primer, as if a book could ring a bell. Bees stitched the light. A dog slept under the table, and a fiddler tuned in the shade. The judge cleared his throat, unfolded the page, and asked his question. Caleb answered, words plain. Sarah followed, voice steady. The judge nodded. Eliza and Clara lifted the veil, then dropped it over all three like a tent, and for a comic beat, the family vanished in gauze. Laughter went up from everyone, even the deputy, who startled himself by chuckling. Caleb moved the cloth aside and set his palm against Sarah's cheek, a touch both public and reverent. He whispered so only she and the open sky could hear. We were always a family. The newborn sighed and returned to sleep. The judge declared them wed beneath branches that had survived wind, fever, drought, rumor, and rage, and the crowd clapped until birds took wing and wheeled once above the tree. Women brought food. Water sloshed into tin cups. Children traced the fence line and came back glowing. The fiddler found a reel that tugged feet into motion. Sarah danced with each daughter, marveling at the miracle of small hands gripping her skirt, because joy and safety had begun to live in the same yard. Caleb took Eliza's hand and matched her solemn steps. Then Clara stood on his boots and spun until the rag pony bounced. Neighbors who had watched from shutters now offered chairs and smiles. Someone set a jug near the trough and then tucked it away. The apple slices vanished. Skillet bread broke into halves and quarters. Sarah tasted sweetness and did not flinch. When shadows lengthened and the ridge drew a copper line, the children lined up on the orchard path for a game of tag, hop, and word. They shouted letters as they jumped between sun patches. Each correct answer earned a flower from the baker's basket. Clara crowned the rag pony and declared it chief of the meadow. A chorus rose from the women, a work song repurposed into a blessing. Sarah found her place in that harmony and felt years of held breath slip away. The deputy taught two boys to knock dust from boots before stepping onto clean boards. Old Mr. Bell, who had once wagered against goodness, praised the pies and paid the fiddler for another tune. The judge sat on a plank, spectacles in his pocket, telling a girl that law works best when it protects the weak first. Caleb moved like a quiet current, checking the gate, resetting a cup, and guiding a freighter to wedge a wobbly plank. He never drifted far from Sarah. When their eyes met, the day balanced. At dusk, lanterns hung from branches, major ceiling of stars within reach. Ribbons tied to the handles let flame and silk share a dance. Women kindled each wick. A child asked whether light weighs anything. Sarah answered that it weighs exactly as much as a promise kept. The newborn woke, stretched, blinked at the lanterns, and relaxed. Caleb took the basket while Sarah gathered the children by the wedding tree. She lifted a primer and began with letters, then words, then a sentence. Eliza read while Clara traced the sounds. Neighbors neared without crowding. The washerwoman's eldest recited. The baker's wife laughed and wept softly. Someone called for a story. Sarah chose the fable about the fox and the patient shell, finished on the line about turning back from thunder, because wisdom keeps a weather eye, and the children made that phrase their chant.
Caleb set the basket down and stood behind her with his hand on her back. Not steering, only confirming ground. The stars climbed. A breeze carried crushed apple. The dog dreamed and thumped its tail. Neighbors stacked dishes. Men folded planks. Someone found a perfect branch for a swing to be strung when daylight returned. The judge asked for one last word and lifted his cup. May this yard remember that dignity tastes like bread and sounds like laughter. People grinned and began their good nights. The last tune faded. Wagons rattled. Crickets tuned their own orchestra. Sarah and Caleb walked the path between trees as Eliza and Clara dashed ahead. The veil turned into a cape, the rag pony riding on a shoulder. At the fence, the scar on the rail shone. Eliza tapped it like a period and whispered, "Home." Sarah felt the word root. She raised the certified page in lantern glow, pinned it beneath her notes. Grateful, returned free, then brushed her fingers over all three until the paper warmed. Caleb set a hand over hers, gentle as a vow. They stood beneath the branches where promises had been spoken, and let quiet carry the meaning. Tomorrow would bring fences, chores, lessons, weather and gray. Tonight belonged to a valley of good work, and to the astonishment of a life mended in daylight. The girls spun through lantern circles, laughter climbing, bare feet sure on soil that had learned a kinder rhythm. Eliza taught Clara a two-step and set the rag pony upon the swing of her arms. Clara improvised a skip that matched happiness. Sarah watched their joy write law across the yard and understood she was no longer waiting for the knock that steals peace. She felt cherished because the hours had proven it. Caleb drew her close and repeated the words that had carried them through. We were always a family. Night deepened. Lanterns dwindled. A coyote called and quieted. Stars. If Sarah's journey from pain to freedom moved you, hit like, share with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of courage and love. Ride with us. Guests formed a ring and clapped time while children spelled their names aloud. Sarah promised lessons each Saturday under the apple tree and invited families and travelers. She thanked the women from the court and neighbors who chose better. Caleb passed plates, poured water, and laughed when Clara declared the rag pony mare. Later he kissed Sarah's brow and said miles of ordinary joy waited, built by patience and shared work. She banked the coals, wrote tomorrow's lesson plan on a feed sack, tucked the primer, and kissed 3 forehead. The wind slipped along the fence and found the hammer hanging straight by the door. The house settled, the orchard breathed, and the sky saved a clear space above the apple tree for more light tomorrow.